The November wind carved through the Montana hills like a blade, carrying with it the promise of an early winter that would show no mercy. In the fading light of dusk, the landscape stretched endlessly, rolling grasslands now brown and brittle, punctuated by scattered pine groves that swayed ominously against the darkening sky. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since morning, and the first snowflakes were beginning to dance in the air, each one a harbinger of the brutal cold to come. 23-year-old Ayana pressed herself deeper into the hollow of an old oak tree, her thin cotton dress providing little protection against the biting wind. Her long black hair, once carefully braided with beads her grandmother had given her, now hung in tangled strands around her face. Dark eyes that had once sparkled with determination now held the hollow look of someone who had accepted their fate. She had been walking for 3 days since they'd forced her from the boarding school, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a determination that was now fading as quickly as the warmth from her body. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School had been her prison for 7 years, a place where they'd tried to kill the Indian to save the man, as they so proudly proclaimed. But Ayana had fought back, had spoken Apache when she thought no one was listening, had carved traditional symbols into her wooden desk when the teachers weren't watching. Her punishment had been swift and final: expulsion in the middle of winter, with no money, no provisions, and nowhere to go. The reservation was 200 miles away, and she knew she'd never make it. Her fingers had long since lost feeling, and her feet, wrapped in thin leather shoes that had holes worn through the soles, felt like blocks of ice. She pulled her knees closer to her chest, trying to conserve what little body heat remained. The snow was falling harder now, coating the ground in a thin white layer that would only grow thicker as the night wore on. Just when hypothermia's welcoming numbness began to creep through her limbs, she heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats against frozen ground. Her heart jumped with a mixture of hope and fear. In her experience, strangers meant danger, especially for a young Apache woman alone in the wilderness. But death by exposure seemed certain now, while the approaching rider at least offered the possibility of survival, however slim. The hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by the creaking of leather and the occasional snort of a horse working hard against the cold. Ayana forced herself to lift her head, peering through the swirling snow toward the sound. Through the white veil, she could make out the silhouette of a man on horseback, moving slowly and deliberately across the hillside. He seemed to be searching for something, or someone. The rider pulled up his horse about 50 yards away, and Ayana could see him more clearly now. He was a white man, probably in his 40s, with graying hair visible beneath his wide-brimmed hat. His weathered face spoke of years spent working under the sun and wind, and his clothes, a heavy wool coat, sturdy boots, and leather gloves, marked him as someone who understood this harsh land. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Even from this distance, she could see they held a sadness that seemed to mirror her own. Thomas McKenna had been riding the perimeter of his property when he'd spotted the figure huddled against the tree. In 20 years of ranching in this isolated part of Montana, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and something about the still form in the growing darkness had made him turn his horse and investigate. As he drew closer, he realized it was a young woman, and she was in serious trouble. "Miss," he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the thin mountain air. "Miss, are you all right?" Ayana didn't respond immediately. Years of conditioning at the boarding school had taught her to be wary of white authority figures, and this man's presence could mean anything from rescue to a fate worse than freezing. But as another gust of wind cut through her like a knife, she realized she had little choice but to trust him. She started, but her voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat raw from the cold. She tried again, louder this time. "I'm very cold." Thomas dismounted and approached slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal, with caution and respect. As he got closer, he could see the blue tinge to her lips, the way her whole body shook with violent tremors. Hypothermia. He'd seen it before in cattle during harsh winters, and he knew she didn't have long. "What's your name?" he asked gently, crouching down a few feet away from her. Up close, he could see she was Native American, Apache, if he had to guess from her features and the traditional beadwork barely visible on her torn dress. "Ayana," she managed through chattering teeth. "I'm Thomas," he said, shrugging off his heavy wool coat. "Ayana, I need to get you somewhere warm, or you're going to die out here. My ranch is about 2 miles from here. Will you let me help you?" She looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception or danger. What she saw instead was genuine concern and a gentleness that surprised her. In her experience, white men didn't look at Apache women with kindness. But the alternative was certain death, and despite everything she'd endured, Ayana wasn't ready to give up. "Yes," she whispered. Thomas wrapped his coat around her shoulders and carefully helped her to her feet. Her legs nearly buckled. She had no strength left. Without hesitation, he swept her up in his arms and carried her to his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Stella, who stood patiently despite the worsening weather. The ride to the ranch was a blur for Ayana. She drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of the warmth of Thomas's body against her back as he held her steady in the saddle. She caught glimpses of snow-covered fields, a wooden fence line, and finally, the warm glow of lamplight from the windows of a modest log cabin. The McKenna ranch house was simple but well-built, designed to withstand the harsh Montana winters. Thomas had built it himself after his wife Sarah's death 5 years earlier, needing something to do with his hands while his heart slowly healed. It wasn't large, just 4 rooms and a stone fireplace that served as the heart of the home, but it was solid and warm. He carried Ayana inside and placed her gently on the sofa near the fireplace, where embers from the evening's fire still glowed. As he moved quickly to stoke the flames back to life, Ayana took in her surroundings through heavy eyelids. The cabin was sparsely furnished but clean, with handmade wooden furniture and a few personal touches. A photograph on the mantel, some books on a shelf, a woman's shawl draped over a chair. "The fire will warm up quickly," Thomas said, adding fresh logs to the growing flames. "I need to get you out of those wet clothes and into something dry." Ayana tensed at his words, and Thomas immediately understood her concern. "I have some of my late wife's clothes," he explained gently. "I'll leave them here for you and step outside while you change. But Ayana, if you don't get warm soon, hypothermia will kill you. Do you understand?" She nodded weakly, and Thomas disappeared into what she assumed was a bedroom. He returned with an armload of women's clothing, a thick flannel nightgown, wool socks, and a heavy robe. "Take your time," he said, heading for the door. "I'll be outside checking on the horses. Call out when you're ready." As the door closed behind him, Ayana felt tears sting her eyes. When was the last time someone had shown her such consideration? Such basic human kindness. At the boarding school, privacy and dignity were luxuries that Indian children weren't allowed. But this stranger, this white rancher, was treating her with a respect she'd almost forgotten existed. With trembling fingers, she peeled off her wet, frozen dress and undergarments, each movement sending sharp pains through her stiff muscles. The flannel nightgown was soft and warm, and as she pulled it over her head, she caught the faint scent of lavender, a woman's scent that spoke of gentleness and care. "I'm ready," she called out, her voice stronger now that she was warming up. Thomas returned with a steaming mug in his hands. "Hot coffee," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "With plenty of sugar. It'll help warm you from the inside." As Ayana wrapped her hands around the warm mug, feeling sensations slowly return to her fingers, she studied her rescuer more carefully. He was indeed in his 40s, with kind hazel eyes and prematurely grey hair that suggested he'd seen his share of hardship. His movements were economical and purposeful, those of a man accustomed to taking care of things, land, animals, and now apparently a half-frozen Apache woman. "Thank you," she said simply, and meant it with every fibre of her being. Thomas nodded, then asked the question she'd been dreading. "What were you doing out there, Ayana, in this weather with no coat, no supplies?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dancing flames of the fireplace. Where could she even begin? How could she explain 7 years of systematic humiliation, of having her culture stripped away piece by piece, of finally fighting back only to be cast out into the wilderness to die? "They sent me away," she said finally. "From the school. They said I was incorrigible." "Oh, ChatGPT, Disa." Thomas had heard of Indian boarding schools and their impact on native children, seeing how they returned to reservations caught between two worlds. After learning about Ayana's painful experiences, he offered her food, as she hadn't eaten in days. As she ate, Thomas observed her strength and resilience despite her hardships, reminding him of his late wife, Sarah. Ayana shared her goal of reaching her people on the San Carlos reservation in Arizona, but Thomas knew it would be impossible for her to make the journey in winter. With the storm worsening, he insisted she rest. Though Ayana tried to refuse, Thomas offered her the bedroom, explaining she needed proper rest. She entered the room, noticing a photo of Sarah, and Thomas shared his wife's death from influenza years ago. Ayana thanked him for his kindness, and Thomas explained he helped because it was the right thing to do, and because he knew what it was like to be left in the cold. As she lay in bed, Ayana felt a rare sense of safety, listening to the storm outside and the quiet sounds of Thomas in the other room. The storm raged outside, but inside, they both found unexpected refuge from a cold, indifferent world. Dawn arrives grey and cold over the Montana landscape, revealing 2 feet of fresh snow that will keep the world isolated for days. Inside the McKenna cabin, Thomas tends the fire while Ayana wakes slowly, disoriented but grateful to have survived the night. The unfamiliar luxury of sleeping without fear feels almost foreign to her after years of trauma. As morning light fills the cabin, Ayana notices details hidden by shadow the previous evening. The bachelor's sparse but clean home, lacking warmth and decoration, save for Sarah's photograph. It feels like a place where someone merely exists rather than truly lives. Over breakfast, Thomas informs her that the heavy snowfall has made roads impassable for at least a week. Though part of Ayana feels relief at having time to recover, she worries about being a burden and offers to work for her keep. Thomas dismisses her concern, insisting her job is simply to regain her strength after nearly dying from exposure. During a tour of the modest ranch, 50 head of cattle and a few horses, Thomas reveals he built the cabin after Sarah's death because their old house held too many painful memories. When he asks about her own losses, Ayana matter-of-factly recounts a litany of grief. Parents dead from disease at 12, her brother killed by soldiers 2 years later, leaving only her grandmother before the boarding school took her away. A quiet routine develops over the following days. Thomas tends his animals while Ayana rests and slowly regains strength. In the evenings, they sit by the fireplace, he mending equipment, she reading from Sarah's beloved books. Their careful, polite conversations gradually deepen as trust grows between them. Thomas shares how he met Sarah at a church social, their dreams of children, and how her death from influenza changed everything. He stopped going to town, to church, to see friends, choosing isolation over the pain of connection. Ayana understands this self-imposed exile, having learned at the boarding school that suffering was supposedly purifying. though she's come to believe suffering can simply become a destructive habit. As Ayana's strength returns, she begins helping with cabin tasks, despite Thomas's protests that she needn't work while recovering. Her efficient, economical movements speak of someone trained to make herself useful anywhere, and she explains her need to feel valuable after 7 years of being told she was worthless. One afternoon, while Thomas checks distant cattle, Ayana accidentally breaks Sarah's picture frame while cleaning, discovering a hidden letter tucked behind the photograph. Though she knows she shouldn't read it, she finds herself drawn to Sarah's final words to her husband, a loving message urging him not to blame himself for her death, not to let grief make him afraid to live again, and her wish to hear laughter in their home once more. When Thomas returns that evening, Ayana confesses to finding and reading the letter. Despite his initial discomfort at this invasion of privacy, he finds himself opening up about his guilt over Sarah's death. His belief that he failed her by not recognizing her illness sooner or getting her to a doctor in time. Ayana gently challenges this self-blame, pointing out that Sarah herself never blamed him. Looking at Ayana in the firelight, Thomas realizes that for the first time in 5 years, he's experienced genuine happiness. Not the desperate joy he'd known with Sarah, but something quieter and more cautious. The happiness of someone slowly learning to live again. That night, Thomas dreams not of loss and regret, but of spring renewal. Melting snow, green grass, planted gardens, and laughter filling rooms silent too long. In what was once his marriage bed, Ayana sleeps peacefully, dreaming of her grandmother's songs, eternal fires, and finally finding a place where she might belong. Outside, the Montana wind continues across the plains, but its sound has transformed from mourning into the promise of inevitable change, slow as the turning of seasons. 2 weeks had passed since the storm brought Ayana to the McKenna ranch. What seemed like temporary shelter was beginning to take on the contours of permanence, though Thomas still wouldn't admit to himself that he dreaded the day she would leave. The routine they had established flowed naturally. Ayana had demonstrated surprising abilities. She handled the horses with intuitive skill and had taken over the kitchen, far surpassing Thomas's basic bachelor cooking skills. That morning, while she prepared breakfast, Thomas mended a bridle cracked by the cold, immersed in a domestic silence that masked unresolved questions about the future. Thomas broke the silence by mentioning the Hendersons, neighbors who were looking for help with spring planting, a temporary work opportunity for Ayana until she could continue on to Arizona. Both knew they were dancing around an inevitable conversation about what would happen when the weather improved. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their reflections. Thomas saw 3 men through the window, Sheriff Bill Crawford and 2 strangers. Ayana, recognizing the danger, positioned herself where she could see the door without being immediately noticed. The men introduced themselves: Sheriff Crawford, Agent Peterson from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and Superintendent Williams from the Hampton Institute. They were looking for Ayana, an Indian girl who had disappeared from the Carlisle school. Peterson explained that she had been improperly released and should be transferred to another institution, not simply turned loose. Thomas felt anger rising as the men spoke of Ayana like property to be collected. When Peterson called her a subject incapable of adapting to civilized society, Thomas insisted she had a name and was a human being. Without realizing it, he revealed that she was there. Ayana decided to show herself. She appeared wearing one of Sarah's dresses, altered to fit her size, with clean braided hair, very different from the broken girl who had fled the school. When Peterson ordered her to gather her things, she simply replied, "No." Thomas intervened, citing the law that allowed Indian adults to leave federal custody if they could prove self-sufficiency and had a responsible guardian. When pressed by the sheriff about what he proposed, Thomas surprised everyone, including himself, by declaring, "I propose that Miss Ayana remain here as my wife." The proposal left everyone stunned. Peterson protested it was scandalous, but Thomas remained firm. When he turned to Ayana asking if she would consider him as a husband, not for convenience, but as a real partnership, she, after looking at the three men who wanted to drag her back to confinement, and then at Thomas, who offered her choice, replied with growing firmness, "Yes, I will marry you." A heated discussion followed, with Peterson claiming fraud and Williams questioning the legitimacy of interracial marriage. But Sheriff Crawford, who had witnessed the effects of Indian schools, supported the right of two adults to marry. The men left reluctantly, with no legal basis to force Ayana's return if she was married to a respectable white citizen. After the visitor's departure, Thomas and Ayana talked deeply about what marriage would mean. Thomas clarified that he wanted a real partnership, not a housekeeper or convenience. Ayana admitted she had never been married, and Thomas acknowledged this would be different from his marriage to Sarah, something they would need to discover together. They spent the morning discussing their fears, hopes, and how they could build a bridge between their different worlds. Thomas promised she wouldn't need to abandon her cultural heritage. He wanted to know her traditions and understand her world. For the first time in 7 years, someone was telling her that perhaps she could be both Apache and accepted by white society. That evening, they rode to town together. Ayana felt every gaze upon them at the courthouse, heard the whispers, but Thomas remained by her side as support. Clark Roberts performed the ceremony with professional courtesy, despite his obvious surprise. No flowers, fancy dress, or family present, just two people promising to honor and love each other. When Roberts declared them husband and wife, Thomas asked permission to kiss his bride. The kiss was chaste, but laden with promises of tenderness and respect, filling Ayana with a hope she had never expected to feel. Riding home under the starlit sky, Ayana reflected on the twists and turns of her life. 3 weeks earlier, she was a discarded student left to die. Now she was Mrs. Thomas McKenna, with a home and a husband who had offered her something unique, the freedom to be herself. When Thomas asked if she had any regrets, Ayana looked at the welcoming light from the cabin windows and replied without hesitation that she had none. That night, as they prepared for sleep, Thomas still on the living room sofa, both understanding that their physical relationship would develop naturally, Ayana contemplated her new life through the bedroom window. The snow-covered fields stretched toward distant mountains, beautiful, harsh, and full of possibilities. She was no longer the Apache girl freezing in the hills, nor the broken student expelled by an uncaring institution. She was Ayana McKenna now, a woman who had found her way through the kindness of a stranger who had become something much more important. A partner in the long journey of building a life worth living. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, curious neighbors, possible conflicts with federal authorities, the delicate work of learning to be married to someone from a completely different world. But that night, she was warm, safe, and free to choose her own path. For the first time in 7 years, that felt like enough. Spring came late to Montana that year, bringing with it a transformation that mirrored the changes in the McKenna household. 3 months had passed since Ayana's marriage to Thomas, and the routine they had established as strangers had evolved into something deeper and more complex. The physical relationship between them developed gradually. The first passionate kiss happened during a moment of laughter over a disastrous attempt at making bread. Ayana was covered in flour when Thomas kissed her with real tenderness and urgency for the first time. Ayana worked in the garden she had planted behind the house, cultivating corn, beans, and squash in the traditional three sisters pattern her grandmother had taught her, alongside carrots and potatoes that Thomas preferred. The garden represented both their worlds, a practical symbol of the compromise that had become the foundation of their marriage. The tranquility was interrupted when Thomas returned from town with neighbor Jim Henderson. Jim brought bad news. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was questioning the legitimacy of Ayanna and Thomas's marriage. Agent Peterson had been asking questions around town, trying to find evidence that the marriage was a fraud. Peterson wanted to prove the marriage was a sham to invalidate it and take Ayanna back into federal custody, claiming she was a runaway ward who had corrupted a good white man. Jim revealed that the agent was building a case, interviewing neighbors, shopkeepers, and even the Methodist pastor about signs of real affection between the couple. Facing external pressure, Thomas and Ayanna realized they would have to publicly demonstrate the authenticity of their relationship. But during this conversation, something deeper emerged. Ayanna confessed that she loved him, not out of gratitude or need for protection, but because he was a good man who saw her as a person worthy of care. Thomas responded that he loved her too, but feared she might think he was taking advantage of the situation. That night, for the first time since their wedding, they shared the same bed, not to prove something to external observers, but because they wanted to, because the barriers between them had finally fallen completely. Thomas was gentle and patient, understanding that this was new territory for Ayanna in ways that went beyond simple physical inexperience. After their intimacy, Ayanna began to share the parts of herself she had kept hidden for 7 years, the Apache stories of creation and transformation, traditional songs, the ceremonies that shaped her early life. In return, Thomas told her about his own family history, Irish immigrants who came to America with nothing but determination. As spring turned to summer, their marriage deepened in ways that had nothing to do with government scrutiny. They learned each other's rhythms and preferences, developed inside jokes and shared memories, weathered their first real argument, and discovered that conflict didn't mean the end of love. Agent Peterson's harassment continued, but now they faced it together. When the federal investigator arrived in August to conduct formal interviews, he found a community that had closed ranks around the McKennas. Neighbors testified to the obvious affection between them. Shopkeepers spoke of how they looked at each other when they thought no one was watching. The final test came when Peterson demanded to interrogate Ayanna without Thomas present. But the woman who sat across from him in the county courthouse was no longer the broken girl who had fled the boarding school a year earlier. This was Ayanna McKenna, a rancher's wife who had found her voice and strength. "You ask if I love my husband as if love is something that can be proven like a mathematical equation," she told Peterson calmly. "But I'll tell you what I know. Thomas McKenna saved my life and then helped me build a new one. He's never tried to change who I am or where I came from. He listens when I speak and values my opinions. He's faithful, kind, and honorable. If that's not love, then I don't understand what love is supposed to be." Peterson left town the next day, his investigation inconclusive. The federal harassment gradually ceased, replaced by official recognition of the marriage. In autumn, Thomas and Ayanna stood on their porch, watching the sunset. Ayanna was pregnant now, carrying the child they both hoped for, a symbol of their merged futures and the family they were creating together. Ayanna reflected on her journey. "I used to think I was nobody. At the boarding school, they tried to erase everything that made me who I was. For a while I believed them. I thought I was just broken, caught between two worlds and belonging to neither." Now she knew she wasn't caught between worlds. She was building a bridge between them, For their child, for them, for anyone else who needed to know it was possible to honor where you came from while embracing where you were going. Under the brilliant stars in the clear mountain air, they stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had found their way home through the storm. Their love story wasn't the kind told in fairy tales, with dramatic rescues and instant passion. It was quieter than that, built on respect and understanding, on the daily choice to see each other clearly and love what they found. The Apache girl, who had been left freezing in the hills, was gone, transformed not by erasure, but by acceptance of herself, of her past, of the possibility that love could be both sanctuary and adventure. In her place stood a woman who had learned that the strongest foundations were built not on forgetting who you had been, but on choosing who you wanted to become.